Europe is home to many of the most beautiful buildings in the world. People flock from all over to bask in the glory of the magnificent architecture. The old churches are breathtaking. A walk through the historic end of town is both magical and romantic. Men poured blood, sweat, and tears into engineering masterpieces. These buildings, built in the 1920s and before, were and still are the buildings that defined the cultures of their countries. These buildings represented the pride of the people, the product of their lifelong labor. Then, after the First World War, things started to change. New buildings began popping up, buildings that were unlike anything known by the people of Europe and America. Within the span of a few decades, the age of beautiful classic architecture was over, and a new age had begun, one where the mightiest buildings in one country were indistinguishable from other countries. So what happened? The year was 1919, the year after the First World War. Germany was left in shambles, and many of its cities were left destroyed. It was time to rebuild, and there was a new government in place, Germany's first democracy, a constitution known as the Weimar Constitution. Across Europe, countries were undergoing big changes. Russia was going through a violent revolution as the Bolsheviks worked to establish communism, and those communist ideas were blossoming in Germany as well. Should Germany become one of these new communist nations? That was the big question of the time, mostly among the youth of the country, who felt like the war was the fault of the rich or the bourgeoisie. These people obviously didn't have the internet to congregate and share their ideas. Their movement wasn't able to organize easily until a 36-year-old man named Walter Gropius came along. Gropius created an art school called the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was a new kind of school, which rejected traditionalism entirely. The school's mission was to reinvent the material world, from paintings and sculptures to furniture and architecture. Before the Bauhaus, art students were expected to be able to understand the human form and be able to create realism. At the Bauhaus, painting a realistic or traditional painting would result in a fail. The school was quick to attract the left-leaning youth of the country. They flocked to Weimar, excited to be part of the only school that openly rejected German culture and tradition. Many of these students were openly communist. And the Bauhaus was quick to become more than a school for these students. It became a place of congregation for young radicals. Students regularly participated and organized left-wing protests in Weimar. So what is Bauhaus? Walter Gropius hired educators from around the world to teach at his new school. Of these, many were communists, and of course they were all rejectors of tradition and classical styles. The goal was to create a new style, an anti-bourgeoisie style. Anything considered remotely wealthy or representing capitalism was a no-no. Buildings couldn't have any ornamental designs. Even complex designs were considered a staple of bourgeoisie architecture, so the Bauhaus style was reduced to using simple shapes, smooth surfaces, and lots of glass. Columns, arches, gables, dormers, and even pitched roofs were all considered taboo. Sloped roofs were sometimes permitted in areas that received heavy snowfall, like ski resorts, but even then it was only a single pitch and never more. Inside, buildings had to remain consistent with the anti-capitalist style. No grand entryways, no columns. 36 inches wide was considered the standard for a hallway. Any bigger was thought to be superfluous. The color palette of Bauhaus architecture was just as simple: black, white, and a shade known as architect's gray. Statues were forbidden unless the statue adhered to the Bauhaus school of thought. The idea of overturning the classical styles and traditionalism was pushed by the faculty, and the young students were quickly radicalized. Students were known to go out into Weimar and damage classical statues and buildings. Students would regularly dump red paint onto classical German statues, often enraging the Weimar locals. Though a great deal of the Bauhaus students were Jewish by blood, most rejected religion entirely, and they believed religion had no place in a progressive world. The Bauhaus students were extremely progressive, even by today's standards. Many were openly homosexual. They were known to participate in large, often homosexual orgies, and gender norms were considered illegitimate, with many men identifying and dressing as women, or identifying with no gender at all. This was radical thinking for the 1920s. The school grew larger and larger, but the country wasn't rebounding from the war. Poverty was growing, the Weimar Republic was struggling to fix the German economy, and the German people were beginning to become divided over their future. The Communist Party was growing, but so was the National Socialist Party. Weimar was a conservative city, and they decided to stop tolerating the activism and destruction by the Bauhaus students, so the Bauhaus school was forced to move to Dessau, a much more left-friendly city. It was in Dessau that the school truly became the meeting place for left-wing revolutionaries. It was in Dessau that an open member of the Communist Party, Hans Meyer, took over the facility, replacing Walter Gropius, while Gropius went on to work as an architect in the country. In Dessau, the Bauhaus was commissioned to build the ADGB Trade Union School and a number of apartment buildings. Germany was now at its poorest point, and its money was almost worthless. Bauhaus architecture was suddenly becoming popular with builders and corporations because of the inexpensiveness of its simplistic style. Now, Germany was quickly changing, and the sudden appearance of buildings that were clearly non-German drove proud Germans further to the right. When the right wing took control over Dessau in 1930, they quickly expelled the Bauhaus, so the school moved again, this time to Berlin. The Nazis also insisted on the firing of Hans Meyer, the communist head of the school. Meyer left for the Soviet Union, along with many of his students. The openly sexual nature of the Bauhaus students started to seep into the art of the movement. Depictions of sexual acts between men, and supposedly sometimes even between adults and children, further provoked the right. Across Germany, Bauhaus art became known as degenerate art, with the right wing. Soon, the Nazis took control of the country, and Bauhaus was forced to shut down. Walter Gropius and the other teachers of the school, now unable to find work because of the new laws forbidding the creation of non-German artwork in buildings, decided to leave the country. Some went to Switzerland, many went to Palestine, areas which later became Israel, and many went to the Soviet Union. Unsurprisingly, since many of the students were Jewish, most ended up in countries with dense Jewish populations. Tel Aviv received a great number of these students. Walter Gropius ended up in America, where he was welcomed as the head of the architecture department at Harvard, the most prestigious architecture program in America. But that's not all Gropius went on to do. He also collaborated with the British with their firebombing program, so that their bombs would be optimally efficient at destroying German houses, as he was very familiar with German architecture. His work with the British made the firebombing of Hamburg and other cities a possibility, killing an estimated 58,000 civilians and wounding 180,000 more, as well as virtually destroying entire cities. You could say that he was living out his dream of destroying classical German architecture. Following the exodus of Bauhaus students and teachers from Germany, Bauhaus architecture began sprouting out everywhere, and it had the Second World War to thank for its popularity. Countries were plunged into poverty as they paid for the war efforts. Bauhaus architecture was cheap and simple to produce, and in many Allied countries, defying classical styles and traditions became a sort of anti-Nazi sentiment. Companies, not wanting to be perceived as too right-wing, adopted the Bauhaus style, which had been rebranded as the Internationalist style, after briefly calling itself the European style. The idea behind the rebranding was to defy nationalism, as nationalism had been blamed for the Second World War. Now, unity between nations would be found in a common art style, the international style, formerly known as Bauhaus. The apartment building was actually a Bauhaus concept. There had been talk before about people living in high-rise structures, but the talk had always been brushed off as nonsense. Before the Second World War, the thought of putting someone to live in a tall building was considered cruel and only something you would do to prison inmates. But with the international style came that familiar anti-bourgeoisie, anti-capitalist sentiment that first defined the Bauhaus. And ironically, it was capitalism that drove the creation of these internationalist apartment buildings across America and Europe. Housing companies jumped on the opportunity to sell hundreds of units on less than half an acre of land. It wasn't long before the international style came to be the most respectable style among architects. "Oh, you don't see it?" became the smug way of dismissing those who disliked the style. Architects who dared to experiment with classical styles were mocked. Internationalist architect Edward Durrell Stone was practically excommunicated from the architecture community after designing the Gallery of Modern Art, which was considered too ornate with arches and curved walls. The modern internationalist style, which is the main style across every Western country in the world, is meant to be bland and uninteresting. People aren't meant to feel proud of their cities or the artwork of their people. Socrates said that the order of the city was the order of the soul at large. The Bauhaus movement, from its inception, was designed to crush this soul. The entire idea of the movement was to eliminate culture and replace it with a blank canvas. Bauhaus students thought that destroying all traditions was the first step into ushering in a truly progressive world, a world that's not hindered by religion or traditions or national pride. There can't be conservatives if there's nothing left to conserve after all. Enjoy this video, click like and subscribe.